When our team got together to decide on the title for our study in the book of Luke, it was obvious that the word lost needed to be in the title. So we landed on the phrase, "so lost without you." And the reason is because a very dominant theme that emerges from the book of Luke is this idea of being lost and then being found. In fact, the verse that this entire book hinges on are the words of Jesus when he spoke about why he came. It's found in Luke chapter 19, verse 10, which we won't actually read in our chapter a day reading adventure for a couple of weeks, but it's a single verse that sets the theme for the entire book. In this verse is Jesus' vision, values, purpose, and mission all wrapped up into a short verse, and here it is. The Son of Man came to find lost people and save them. The Son of Man came to find lost people and save them. Now, there is something very inspirational and even exciting about that statement. First, it's short, so it's easy to remember. Why did Jesus come? To find lost people and save them. Second, it's laser focused. Business and strategic leaders would be impressed by how concentrated and laser focused Jesus was. Third, it's not self-serving. The whole reason Jesus came was for the benefit not of himself, but of others. It's the ultimate altruistic mission statement. However, as I began wrapping my mind around the purpose and mission of Jesus, I began to panic a bit. I thought, hold it. As inspiring and exciting and strategic as that statement might be for Christ followers, it's going to be problematic and offensive to everyone else. To put it bluntly, nobody likes being referred to as being lost. My first panic-fueled thought was, Jesus, you can't say that today. You can't go around talking about finding lost people and saving them. People are going to be offended and insulted by that kind of talk. If the past 20 years have taught us anything, it's that people, mostly Christians reacting to an offended world, hate the word evangelism. Going out witnessing to people used to be a thing, but nobody witnesses anymore. And to tell someone that they're lost comes off as judgmental, mean-spirited, prideful, and insulting. Now, most often at the end of a ranting little prayer like that, I don't really expect a reply, but this time I got one. 3 words. Are you sure? I felt a nudge to ask the question, is there proof that the world feels insulted by the word lost? And I wasn't 3 keystrokes into my investigation, and my eyes began to become open, my perspective began to change. Let me show you a bit of what the world is talking about and how the world feels these days. The first hit I got when I typed in the 2 words, world and lost, was this one. With the headline, "The world lost 2/3 of its wildlife in 50 years. We are to blame." I thought, well, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. But then I felt the nudge again, and I sensed I needed to absorb this for a minute. After reading the article, it seemed like this report might actually be more about humanity having lost its way than the decline of animal species. And the end of the article proved my suspicions with this quote, "We can't ignore the evidence. These serious declines in wildlife species populations are an indicator that nature is unraveling and that our planet is flashing red warning signs of system failure, and the reason given was us and humanity." Interesting. A scientist stating that nature is unraveling and our planet is flashing red warning signs of system failure. That sort of sounds like someone saying, we've lost our way. I pressed on. I thought maybe instead of searching world and lost, I needed to search world and unhinged. Boom! Up pops an article with an intriguing title, "We Are the 7%. Why the World Feels More Unhinged Than Ever." The article went on in somewhat panicked tones to state that world population acts as a magnifying glass to every civilization level ill we face, and that 7% of all the humans to ever have lived on the planet are alive today. Let that sink in for a moment. If you took every human being who has ever lived on this planet through all the ages, the world population has exploded so much that 7% of all the humans who ever have lived are alive today. That's mind-blowing, and the author was clearly stating that the world does feel unhinged. And one of the reasons is that we have never had more people on the planet, consuming resources, navigating relationships, and trying to manage humanity's brokenness in all of its varied expressions. Continuing on this world unhinged search thread, this article in a famous magazine popped up next. Is it even moral to have a kid in today's unhinged world? In the first paragraph, the writer describes opening a newspaper and seeing, quote, an immense panorama of horror and futility. Wars, famines, the ongoing dissolution of political order, increasingly depraved levels of income inequality, and towering implacably above it all, the rising tide of an imminent climate catastrophe. I had to double take. It sounded more like a prophetic passage from the Bible than a paragraph from a men's style magazine. Next, I typed in the word world and crazy. A few seconds later, I was reading an article entitled, Why the World is Going Crazy and How to Win Back Our Minds. The author began by saying, it does feel like the handrails, the things we used to look to for stability and security have evaporated, and that we're experiencing a catastrophic collapse of meaning. A catastrophic collapse of meaning. This wasn't a pastor or theologian speaking. This was a non-religious academic describing the world in which we live. Soon I was drowning in articles like, it feels like the world has gone crazy, and why has the world come unhinged, and global risks, a foundation that is on a mission to save the world from a global catastrophic event that could wipe out 10% of the population or more, listing no less than 9 threats that are currently looming over and threatening the human race. But the website and the book that pushed my thoughts over the edge and changed my perspective was called Adrift. The author, Amin Alouf, a Lebanese-born award-winning writer, began his book by recalling a time not so long ago when there was little change in our world. People lived on the land that their parents lived on. They worked and earned a living as their parents did. They were educated the same. They traveled by the same means, and they believed life would always be this way. However, Amin points out, now in the span of a life, entire countries, empires, peoples, languages, businesses, and civilizations are disappearing. Life is changing at an unprecedented rate of speed. In his book, Amin fixes upon an image of a gleaming, modern ocean liner, advertised as unsinkable, that all of humanity is traveling on, sailing proudly towards its own destruction. He goes on to declare that the triumph of capitalism has brought with it an obscene explosion of inequality, and that the global population and its demand for products to sell and consume is fueling a machine that will one day fly off the rails and spectacularly melt down. When I finished reading these headlines and articles, I felt like someone who had spent the last couple of years in a bomb shelter, speculating what the world on the outside was like. But it wasn't until I unbolted the door and stuck my head out and took a good look around that I realized my assumptions were totally wrong. Our world is lost, and it knows it. It's not uncommon for people, credible non-religious people with large audiences, to admit that they're feeling like the world is going crazy, or that the world is unhinged, or that we're lost and heading towards destruction. And into this world, our world, steps Jesus with the same vision, mission, purpose, and strategy that he had 2,000 years ago, saying, the Son of Man came to find lost people and save them. Now, later in the series, as we make our way towards the cross and the resurrection of Jesus in chapters 23 and 24, we'll examine the method and the power of Christ's salvation and what it means to be saved. But this weekend, following our reading of Luke chapter 7 to 11 this past week, I would love to show you what it looked like when Jesus set out to find lost people and save them. If you ever have a chance to go to Rome, I highly recommend that you set aside some time to walk through the Vatican Museum. But be warned, you're probably going to end up having a very sore neck by the end of the day. The reason is that so many of the biblical stories and themes are painted on the ceilings, and you'll spend hours studying and interpreting the magnificent paintings on the ceilings. Well, today, I'd like to swing wide the doors of the portrait gallery and the grand hallway that runs from Luke chapter 5 through Luke chapter 8 and give you something of a private tour of some exquisite scenes from Luke's gospel, Scenes of Jesus doing what he does best, looking for the lost and saving them. So look up. And the first is a breathtaking scene of Jesus ignoring a biohazard warning sign and walking right up to a man with an advanced case of leprosy in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 16. Talk about someone who was lost. Lepers were people who were forced into quarantine. They had to leave their families and live in communes with other infected people. And Jewish people were forbidden from touching a leper or even being around them, otherwise they would become ceremonially and spiritually unclean. And this is what we read in verse 12. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said, be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. If I was going to mount a plaque under this portrait, I'd have it say, Jesus went after the people everyone else feared. You know, it would have been so easy for Jesus to say, I'm going to look for the lost amongst the influential. I'm going to look for the lost amongst the important who can affect change with others. But instead, Jesus went after the very guy nobody else would talk to, the guy everybody else was afraid of, and he found him. Jesus talked with him. Jesus touched him. Jesus was moved by the man's pain and his story, and Jesus healed the man, restoring him to his family, his town, and giving him his life back. Jesus went after people everybody else was afraid of. But moving down the hall, we come to another gorgeous scene spread across the ceiling. And I suspect that this portrait is well known to you. It's a picture of Jesus being interrupted as straw and dry mud and sticks and various other building materials rain down on him in the middle of a meeting that he's hosting in Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26. 4 guys, a little desperate and a whole lot impetuous, haul their paralyzed friend up to the roof, cut a hole in the roof, and lower their friend down right in front of Jesus. Now, Jesus could have had 100 different reactions. He could have called security to haul this guy away and get those guys off the roof before they kill themselves. He could have schooled the 5 of them in safety or respect for someone else's property or the fairness of waiting in line like everybody else had to. And yet Jesus knew that this guy was lost. This guy was often ignored and forgotten. He's the guy sitting in the market begging for some handouts as everybody else walks to the other side, making sure not to make eye contact. He's the guy left at home when everyone else is heading out for a night on the town. And yet, we see that Jesus went after the people everyone else ignored. Then Jesus says in Luke chapter 5, verse 24, "So I will prove to you that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins." Then Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, "Stand up, pick up your mat, and go home." This guy would never again be ignored or forgotten, as everybody would want to hear his story of how Jesus confronted his lostness and found him. I have to admit, this is one of my favorite galleries, because every scene paints a picture of something so unexpected, so backwards from what you would assume. Take this next scene, painted on the ceiling of the Gallery of the Lost being found. It's from Luke chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. While walking out of town, Jesus spots a scoundrel, a cartel boss, a guy who intimidates and threatens his own people in order to get kickbacks from the Roman occupiers, a guy the Pharisees literally called scum. And instead of walking on the other side of the road, Jesus walks right up to him and says, "Follow me." Now, this was a phrase that the rabbis would say to someone at the end of a very long selection process designed to weed out the unworthy. A rabbi might have 100 candidates, and he would narrow the list down to that final candidate that was worthy of being called a disciple of the rabbi. Then he would go to that candidate and say, "Follow me." So the phrase "follow me" wasn't unique. However, a rabbi would never say those words to someone like Matthew. And if you look closely at this picture, you will see the inscription, "Jesus went after the people everyone loved to hate." Interestingly, before meeting Jesus, Matthew probably never considered himself lost. He was wealthy. He had power and a big house. He was in control, and he had friends in high places. Yet one look into Jesus' eyes, and he realized how lost he really was. And he gladly walked away from it all to follow Jesus. We're going to take a short break before completing our tour, but already a powerful picture is beginning to emerge. Jesus didn't just declare a nice-sounding mission or purpose statement when he said, "I have come to find the lost and save them." He backed it up with his life long before the cross. Number one, Jesus went after the people everyone else feared. Number two, Jesus went after the people everyone else ignored. Number three, Jesus went after the people everyone loved to hate. Jesus saw their value. Jesus saw their potential. Jesus saw their deep lostness and knew how to find them. And Jesus chose them to be part of his team and part of his family. I find this challenging on so many levels, and we'll pick up on that in a few minutes. But first, let's take some time to worship God together. I find Jesus' example of going after the lost incredibly challenging. For starters, Jesus had such a keen sense of who was lost and who needed saving. In our highly advanced, highly technical, highly scientific, and self-sufficient world, many of us have abandoned the search for lost people, and yet they're all around us. But I also find who Jesus went after challenging. So far, we've discovered that he went after the feared, the ignored, and the hated. But he did that because he had the ability to look past their circumstances and their outward condition. Jesus had such a pure and genuine love for people, regardless of how they were perceived or how they presented. But our tour through the portrait gallery painted with stunning scenes on the ceiling isn't done yet. In Luke chapter 7 this past week, we saw another stunning portrait of Jesus going after the lost. This time it's a Roman officer. A Roman centurion sent word to Jesus that one of his slaves was dying and he wanted Jesus' help. Again, this would have been a perfect opportunity for Jesus to say, "Not going to happen. You guys and your government are oppressing the Jewish people. You are illegal occupiers, squeezing my people and our land for resources. You're the enemy, and until you stop this oppression, don't expect anything from me." But that's not what Jesus did. Instead, he heals the Roman officer's slave and declares that he has never seen such great faith, even in Israel. Jesus went after the people everyone else saw as an enemy. This is one of the most distinct characteristics of the way of Christ, to love your enemies. And Jesus didn't just teach it, he did it. But before we even read to the end of chapter 7, we watch as Jesus goes after another lost person, a woman with a reputation of sex and scandal. This painting is a bit darker than the others as it portrays a scene that is indoors. A respectful religious leader called a Pharisee has invited Jesus over for dinner. Undoubtedly, some of his Pharisee friends have also been invited. However, the main character in this picture is a person who wasn't invited, a woman who crashed the party. Bible commentators suspect that this woman was a sex worker, and here she is at the dinner party hosted by a Pharisee, and she's kneeling at Jesus' feet, and then it happens. The woman starts to cry. Deep, remorseful sobs, big tears. She notices her tears falling on Jesus' feet. So she instinctively takes her hair and wipes the tears. The Pharisees are livid. Then she takes her perfume, no doubt a tool of her trade, and she pours the perfume on Jesus' feet. The Pharisee named Simon can't take it anymore and voices his protest. Jesus has once again become religiously unclean in a most scandalous way. So what does Jesus do? Well, in classic Jesus style, he tells a story. A story about two people who owe a man money. One owes the man $100,000 and the other about $10,000. However, the man did something unheard of and forgave both of them their debts. Then Jesus asked Simon the Pharisee this question: which person do you suppose loved the man who forgave the debt more? The one who had $10,000 forgiven, or the one who was off the hook for $100,000? Simon could see where this was going, but he had no choice. The one who was forgiven the larger amount, he said. Then Jesus said to him, I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown so much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only little love. Then Jesus said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. The Pharisees were flabbergasted. But from this portrait, we learn that Jesus went after the people everyone else despised. And that brings us to our final painting in the gallery of portraits. And this one is shocking. It has multiple panels, and the first panel is of a madman. He lived as an outcast in the caves across the Sea of Galilee from where Jesus was staying. This is fascinating. Do you see that boat in the background of the painting? That's a boat that Jesus just sailed across the Sea of Galilee on. That's a boat the disciples were screaming like schoolgirls, terrified that they were going to die in the middle of a storm. And that's a boat from which Jesus commanded the wind and the waves to stop. Now they're in Gerasene, across the Sea of Galilee. And it would seem that they have come here for one reason, so that Jesus can find the madman who runs around naked and is often chained up to protect himself and the townsfolk, but it often escapes the chains, running off naked into the caves to hide like he's done for many years. And Jesus finds him, and he asks him his name. It's Legion, because he is filled with a legion of demons. You probably remember the story. Jesus commands the demons to come out. They beg him to send them into a herd of pigs. He does, and immediately the herd rushes over a cliff and drowns in the waters below. When all the townsfolk come running out to see the disaster for themselves, they can't believe their eyes. The man known as Legion is sitting clothed and in his right mind, set free from both his shackles and from the madness that has controlled him for so long. And the last panel in this portrait is a scene of a crowd, fists and pitchforks in the air, chasing Jesus back to the boat because they were fearful of what Jesus could do. But Jesus doesn't leave this portrait without proving that Jesus went after the people everyone had given up on. We tend to be fairly quick to give up on people, but Jesus never does. So, rubbing your sore neck and looking back over the 6 brilliant portraits Luke paints in the gallery of the lost who were found, you might be wondering, what am I supposed to take from this? And why did Jesus go after these people in particular? Great questions, and the same questions I was left to ponder in my study this past week. Number 1, Jesus went after the people everybody else feared. Jesus went after the people everybody else ignored. Jesus went after the people everyone loved to hate. Jesus went after the people everyone else saw as an enemy. Jesus went after the people everyone else despised. And Jesus went after the people everyone had given up on. But why? Well, I can think of only one answer to that question. To prove that there was nobody he wouldn't go after. To prove that there was nobody that lives outside of his awareness and love and desire for relationship. If Jesus could find these lost people and save them, then he can certainly find anyone and save everyone who is willing, including you. Now, inside you might be protesting with something like, I don't need saving. I'm not lost. I gave my life to Christ years ago, decades ago. I'm good. I'll challenge you with the same 3 words the Holy Spirit challenged me with. Are you sure? Because from what I've seen, Christians can be lost, and Christians never outgrow their need for Jesus. Maybe today you're lost in depression, or maybe you're lost in worry. Maybe the unhinged, crazy, lost world is wearing you down and you're lost in fear and doubt. Maybe you're all good and healthy and doing great, or maybe you're lost in wealth and a life of ease. Or maybe you're lost in a sin that has you shackled and going crazy inside. Maybe you're lost in weariness or some despair. Maybe you're like the disciples, screaming like a little schoolgirl on the inside, terrified of the wind and the waves and the storms of life that are threatening you today. Maybe you're like the guy in the stretcher, being lowered by the friends, and you feel stuck and immobile and feeling paralyzed. Maybe you're lost in the pain of a marriage that is falling apart, and you have no clue how to fix it. Maybe you're lost in the physical pain of a disease or illness that has its hideous claws in you, and you want so desperately to be healthy again. Or maybe you've lost hope, and you're just tired of being part of the 7% of humans ever to have lived that are alive today. Maybe you're overwhelmed by inflation and COVID, and the news of monkeypox and wars and protests and interest rates and mass shootings and the climate crisis and the increase in violence and economic uncertainty, and you've simply lost hope. If you identify with any of those strains of lostness, you need to hear this. Jesus is looking for you. His mission is the same today as it was 2,000 years ago, to find the lost and save them. And the portrait hall in Luke reminds us that he went after the most lost and saved them. And if he can save them, he can save anyone from anything, even you, because he is our King who is faithful forever and faithful to the very end.